Community Interactive, Poverty, the Working Poor was made possible in part by support from the Arizona Daily Star, Cox Communications, and Nancy and Peter Davis.
Poverty, education, the border, the arts. Each of these topics presents a complex web of difficult challenges and personal decisions. Each confronts us with problems so huge in scope, so ubiquitous, that just taking a first step towards a solution seems overwhelming. Arizona Public Media and the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona have partnered to create Community Interactive, a series of live events offering Southern Arizonans an opportunity to participate in a solution-driven conversation on these and other pressing issues. The premier Community Interactive event, Poverty, the Working Poor, was recorded before a live audience at the Fox Theater downtown on February 12, 2014. It featured a panel of educators, social service professionals, and others working every day to understand the plight and address the needs of Southern Arizona's working poor. The conversation was moderated by renowned journalist, producer, and former host of NPR's Talk of the Nation, Neal Conan.
By many measures, we've lost ground in the 50 years since President Johnson first declared war on poverty. And by most measures, Tucson struggles behind most American cities. That's not to say that local, state, and federal programs don't help. They do. Great teachers inspire homeless students. Private groups provide meals and housing and dental care and so much more. But anyone with eyes to see can know that we have much more to do. This is not a question of a handout for them. Those people are our neighbors and friends, and even the better off among us worry that our families are just a diagnosis, an accident, or a pink slip away from the edge. Guess what? We're not going to solve this problem tonight. And guess what? We should not expect miracle solutions from Phoenix or Washington, D.C. Okay, maybe the legislature and Congress will vote for higher minimum wage laws or for dramatic increases in social programs, but don't bet on it, at least not anytime soon. If we're to make progress in the short and medium term, we'd best rely on what we've got. So let's start here tonight. We've assembled an extraordinary panel to help us address three questions: what we're doing now, what we can do better, and we'll begin with who we're talking about.
Who are the working poor in Southern Arizona?
They have a job, but that job doesn't pay enough for them to really survive.
In Tucson, 1 in 5 live in poverty. Nearly 40% have at least one job. Children in poverty are more likely to grow up to be unemployed, unhealthy, and in trouble with the law.
They're still kids. They still need a community that shows them, we know you know that you can do it, but we're going to help you. We're going to be behind you.
In America, 1 in 5 kids live in poverty. Statewide, it's 1 in 4. In Tucson, 1 in 3 struggle to survive. And 1 in 10 of our neighbors' children are extremely poor, meaning a family of 3 must survive on an annual income of less than $9,000. And yet, over the past 6 years, in the midst of the recession, the number of poor kids receiving cash assistance decreased by almost half.
My niece, she wants this and that. Well, she can't have this and that because we got to make it through the month.
Poverty is highest among women, children, female-headed households, individuals living in non-family households, American Indians, Hispanics, those with less than a high school degree, the foreign-born, and persons who are not employed or who work less than full-time.
Michael McDonald, now with the Community Food Bank of Southern Arizona, previously Executive Director of Habitat for Humanity Tucson. I want to begin with you. You see those statistics walk through your door every day. What surprises you?
Neal, I think what surprises me, I've been doing human service work for over 10 years, and we know the need is huge, and they are us. So my first day at the food bank, we have hundreds of people coming there every day. I walked out into the parking lot, and I see my former boss. And Allison is there because she needs to stretch a buck a little further and was picking up an emergency food box. It's shocking that the working poor are us.
And do they come in with a sense of stigma?
Of course, because if you lose a job and things happen that you didn't choose, and what you have to do is then choose how to become more self-sufficient. And that's why we have a safety net in our country and in this community, is to help people, give them a hand up towards self-sufficiency.
Lane Kenworthy, professor of sociology and political science at the University of Arizona. You're a student of the causes and consequences of poverty. Let me ask you a question. Why Tucson?
You mean, why do I study Tucson?
No, why is Tucson having more trouble than most?
Yeah, well, so the first thing to recognize is that I think we shouldn't get too fixated on the poverty rate. So it's a useful number, but it's just a number. If you're an individual adult living alone, the poverty line, as the government establishes it, it's close to $12,000 a year. If you're a family of four, it's around $23,000. But if you're a single adult living alone and your income's $15,000 a year, you're still going to struggle to get by. If you're a family of four and you're making $25,000 or $28,000, it's going to be a very, very difficult life. So there are a variety of reasons, I think, why Tucson seems to have a higher poverty rate than other large metro areas, other large cities. But the truth is we haven't fully figured that out. So I'm in the middle of a research project. One of the things we've done is look at various socio-demographic groups to see if Tucson's overrepresented with any of these groups that are more likely than others to be poor. And Latinos are one such group, but apart from that, we don't observe very much of this phenomenon. What seems to happen is that among all groups, poverty rates are higher in Tucson than they are in other large metropolitan areas. So a big part of this research effort that's underway is to figure out more about that.
Let's turn to Margaret Cheney, who teaches at the Tucson High Magnet School, and thank you very much for being with us this evening. I want to ask you, you see this every day in the faces of the children in your classroom.
I would have to say absolutely, I see it every day. I have students who arrive in school very hungry, very unprepared, very listless at times, unable to focus, unable to finish their work. And it's frustrating because you ask them, well, please come to conference, please bring your supplies, and so forth, the normal sorts of questions you would ask, and they respond with, well, I just forgot. And then you find out months later it's because they were homeless, or because their parents just split and now they have nothing, or there was a house fire and they lost everything overnight. Or often, because I work in exceptional ed, we have some students who have chronic illnesses, as completely devastating as cancer. And with those kinds of medical bills and those kinds of worries on their mind, and their parents unable to pay those bills, the last thing on their mind is, the homework assignment you gave them last week or the test tomorrow.
I know that there are kids who come out of that situation, who go on to college, who go on to succeed, but you also know that statistically speaking, you're failing. What gives you hope?
Usually for me, I'm hopeful that my students will support each other, that their teachers and their administrators and our district will support them, give them some sort of faith that there is a next day and that there is help available. We've been focusing on my department on advocacy, and because oftentimes we're not clear on what it is that they really need. And so we're teaching them how to ask for help and not lose their dignity.
And do you stand as an example to them?
Myself?
Yeah.
I grew up in Chicago on the South Side, and it was a major struggle dealing with the kind of poverty that was apparent at my school: broken windows, no heat, no books, roaches crawling on the desk. It was a major struggle, crime every day. And when you're fearful for your life, again, the last thing you are thinking about is the test the next day.
Molly Costellazzo, economist, political scientist, founder and president of Costellazzo Content. Let me turn to you. And we don't get very far in this analysis without realizing the first group among those listed among who are the working poor are women.
That's true, absolutely. So we have just finished a report that will be released soon for the Women's Foundation of Southern Arizona and the Arizona Foundation for Women, conducted by the Grand Canyon Institute, and we painted a picture of the economic status of low-income women in the state of Arizona. And the kind of first statistic that sticks out that is a driver of a lot of the difficulty that low-income women have is that they're vastly more likely than men are to be solely responsible for children. And when you're a single mom...
Nice cue.
When you're a single mom and you're responsible for childcare, that can make it very difficult to work. And of course, as is obvious, it's rising out of poverty is difficult if you can't work, as the video said, year-round and full-time.
Let me follow up. We solicited email questions in leading up to this event, and this came in from a woman named Nancy Smith, a listener who writes that her son, his expenses add up to more than his income between child care, health insurance, student loans, rent, food, etc. There never seems to be enough, and my son makes much more than the minimum wage, and he works full-time. Wouldn't free or subsidized child care be the smartest step, not just for those below the poverty line, but for single parents earning $25,000 to $30,000 a year? Isn't that the definition of working poor that she's talking about?
It absolutely is. And, in our research, we found that I think the average cost of child care is somewhere between $800 and $1,000 a month. And of course, it can be much more than that. And for someone who is living even well above the poverty line, that's simply, untenable. And the state of Arizona did subsidize child care. And in the past few years has completely eliminated funding for subsidized child care.
And that leaves parents in a complete bind.
Correct.
We're going to be exploring what we can do better, including maybe child care, a little bit later in this event, but we're going to begin next with a few examples of what we're doing now.
I was on public assistance, I was on access and food stamps, and I'm not embarrassed to say that, that's a reality. I'm grateful that I was able to tap into those services and use them. And again, I had family and friends who helped me say, Jim, don't worry about it. We know who you are. We support you. Just stay focused. Something's going to happen. And it did. Now all those benefits I am a completely independent, self-sustaining man again, which is a gift.
We have this dental RV that we bought 3 years ago with a grant, and we go to schools in our area of service to provide dental care for kids who would have no other way to get dental treatment. If you were a mom and you worked full-time and you had very little money and your kid was in school, which would you prefer to do? Take a half a day off work, take your child out of school and take them to the dentist when you found one that would see you, or have the RV come to your school and your child misses half an hour of class and goes right back.
For the first week or two when I didn't have any of the school supplies, I was just kind of hoping hopefully I don't have to start taking notes right away, or if there is that possibility, I'm going to be asking the person who's sitting next to me, can I have a piece of paper to use? Do you have a pen too? Just kind of you go and ask one person for one thing and another for something else, and hopefully you can find one, walk in the halls that's just sitting on the floor, just a pen or a pencil that you don't have to really give back.
That's when he got help from Youth on Their Own, a nonprofit organization that helps students without a permanent home graduate from high school. As a Youth on Their Own student, Tim was able to get a new backpack full of school supplies, but also motivation to stay in school. He's one of about 1,200 students who received help from Youth on Their Own last year.
At Hope Incorporated, an outpatient treatment center in Tucson, people drop in for breakfast, organize community meetings, and even host the occasional talent show. From its beginnings as an informal coffee shop get-together in the early 90s, Hope has grown into an established peer-run center that saw more than 3,800 people in 2012 alone.
Like thinking about all different kinds of things.
People need to feel like they have a purpose. And it's corny. We need to be able to give them hope. People need to have hope. I used to say when I first came here, we offer you hope until you can find it.
You're gonna make me cry right now, you know that?
Yeah.
I love you.
I love you too.
Herminia Cubillos, Executive Director of JobPath, a Tucson nonprofit. Thank you for being with us.
You pronounced my name beautifully. Thank you very much.
First time for everything. Let me ask you, you provide some of those programs that help. Are these addressing root causes, or are these Band-Aids?
Well, it was interesting looking at the first part, because a lot of those individuals are the background of our participants. We at JobPath was created by Pima County Interfaith Council and the business group to provide a way to provide opportunities and support adults who wanted to improve their lives. And I always say education is the way to get out of poverty. It happened to me, it happened to my family, it happens to a lot of people. We, the typical participant that comes in is usually underemployed or unemployed because they got laid off, making about $9,000 a year. By the time they finish their training, and we do believe in long-term training, so we believe in an associate's degree or in a certificate, they end up making $42,000. And that's been consistent for the past 15 years. We work. Our model works. Some of these people on the panel know about our work because they've read about us. I believe the other thing that works is collaboration. Tucson is very strong in collaboration. I think we have some wonderful resources like the libraries, Pima County One Stop, Pima Community College, and we can go on and on. And I think that those collaborations really help this community move on.
Yet, if more people were engaged in that project, we wouldn't be up here talking about it. Can you be scaled up?
We always talk about scale. We work very closely with a labor economist out of MIT, Dr. Paul Osterman, and he always talks about scale. And it's tough. Scale is tough. The Obama's administration talks a good talk, but where's the money? So
that comes in this another email. This is from John Shanahan, who said he was going to be here tonight, and he asked if there was a current post-secondary training program to provide job skills and one paid for by federal, state, public, and private grants. Is there a need for such a program, he asked, and if so, if yes, who could lead its development? So who could scale it up is what I'm saying.
Well, we always talk about scaling, and I think that maybe at some point, some of them, we are entering into some collaborations with groups that have targeted the same population we want to target, which we call the first generation people. Yes, there are programs, and if we collaborate and if we work together and be persistent, we could scale it up, maybe in a way that's innovative and not the typical throwing a lot of money to one group and having it do all the whole work.
Patty Caldwell, Executive Director of Our Family Services, a program which focuses, among other things, on homelessness and housing. And thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
As you look at this panoply of services that are provided to people, including from your agency, clearly there are gaps, clearly there are overlaps. What more needs to be done?
Well, so I think the part of what I observe is that we're really fortunate. We have a lot of great nonprofit organizations and public-private partnerships that are doing a variety of pieces, which is what I think you're referencing. And I don't see a lot of overlap. What I do see is the pieces are too small to impact the problem. I mean, I think earlier when you asked if we're just putting Band-Aids on, certainly from our perspective, that feels like what we're doing a lot of the time.
And you need Band-Aids because people are bleeding, but you need to address the root cause too.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, I think for whatever reason, we haven't found the energy, the space to be able to have those conversations as a community to ensure that we're not just putting on Band-Aids, or even just, it's wonderful to help a family and then another family. But the need is so broad, and the kinds of things that could really move the needle take a lot of collaboration, and they take putting some of the funding streams we're using now together so that we can really focus on where it can make the most difference.
And as you look at that prospect, do you see broad-based agencies like yours, a necessity to focus more on one or two aspects, or stay with the panoply?
Well, I think it's less about individual agencies and more about we actually need to get all the agencies kind of together who are interested in making the same kind of impact, and figure out what each of us do best and make sure that we can scale up those pieces we do best together and in concert to make an impact.
Peggy Hutchinson, the CEO of the Primavera Foundation, a nonprofit with programs from emergency shelters to neighborhood revitalization. Thank you for joining us tonight. That program that Patty Caldwell was just talking about, that meeting, that'd be a really interesting meeting, wouldn't it?
Yes, and actually there are some conversations happening in our community around that. I just want to affirm what's been said. We live in an incredibly generous community. We have some very strong programs that are trying to invest in assets. We have a business community that's small but very generous. Thousands and thousands and thousands of our neighbors are volunteering, right? So there's a lot of real positive, important work happening, but we're just touching individuals and families, maybe pockets of neighborhoods. And if we're going to scale up, if we're really going to have impact, I think, I want to kind of continue on that conversation, which is we've got to start working better cross-sector. So, for example, we know that a safe, affordable home matters, right? We know education matters. We know that a living wage, employment matters. We know that civic engagement matters. We know that public safety matters. But we really don't know how we intersect together. And we also don't know what kind of investment, energy, resources, time will really move that needle.
Do we know which programs work and which don't?
Yes and no, right? I mean, some of us have been talking about data earlier today at a conference, and some of us, we do have some data, but we really don't have the rigorous data that we need that will really inform how much of a real impact we're making. That doesn't mean that individuals and families and even pockets of neighborhoods, schools, it doesn't mean that there's not progress. If we didn't have the inputs, if we didn't have some of the generosity in our community, we would be much worse off than we are.
Herminia Cubillos, let me go back to you. When we were researching for this program to look into some of the nonprofits groups that are here in Tucson, we couldn't find a list of these groups anywhere. We couldn't come up with any kind of definitive posting of who does what, or for what reason, or where they are. Maybe the IRS knows. But we couldn't figure it out, and we spent 2 weeks doing it. There's a lot of different groups. Do you guys know who's doing what and whether it works or not?
Well, the city and the county know who's out there because they fund a lot of us. I think that we know, in terms of the staff, let's take about my staff, we know some of the resources that are out there, and we do connect with those individuals, connect with those agencies, send people out to those agencies for that extra help. The food bank's one of them. I know we use them a lot. The Pima County One Stop with their WIB is another one. I want to say that Tucson is a very generous community, and it's also very collaborative. When we tried to start a job path in Phoenix, I will tell you this, that I've never saw such dysfunction and dislike towards the poor like I saw in the Maricopa area. I was just taken aback. And some minister told me, Phoenix, in Maricopa, we don't like the poor. I mean, he wasn't talking about himself. So I think that we do have an opportunity in this community because we're isolated, because we have this compassion here, but more than compassion, we have a strong work ethic to try to help families, help them move themselves up. So it does exist.
Michael McDonald, let me bring you back in and let me ask if we're sometimes too busy just getting that plate of food on the table.
Well, yes. I mean, the food bank, we are a relief organization, and there's not enough food that we can pass out. And so we have got to be part of the solution to end poverty and look at root causes. And what are the root causes of hunger? It's lack of food security. It's lack of nutrition education. It's lack of a local food infrastructure to grow our own local sustainable food. And how do you get folks involved? The working poor, how do they have time to grow their own food? So, you know, there are a number of complex issues, and you're right, Neal, we need to do a better job of collaborating across our own sector. And we've got a great, generous business community. You know, you asked earlier, the face of poverty. The solution of poverty, it's all three sectors. It's not government's job anymore. That's clearly they're outsourcing it to us. We can't do it alone, and we don't have any panelists up here from the business community. So, you know, it is really all three sectors of the economy pulling together, because this is an economic development activity as much as it is a human service activity.
And we've already started to breach the question. We've already started to discuss the question of what we could be doing better. Let's focus on that now.
I don't know if we need a new war on poverty, but we probably need to look at how we can take a noble thought that was 50 years old and make it viable for the 21st century.
It's education, it's building capacity, and it's building capacity across all levels. How do we build stronger families? How do we have our families support our kids with their education?
We need more training to develop more skills, not just from, in the high schools and the colleges, something that you can get into immediately and start building your own basic income.
A lot of people in my community are really willing to work, but there's no jobs out there. There's no full-time jobs out there. There's no living wage jobs out there.
What we eventually want to do is move them into jobs. And once they achieve jobs, then they can achieve housing. And eventually we're going to be looking for employers that will specifically want to hire our ladies.
We do have to have a more organic approach and meet the individual where they're at. Just sort of saying, what do you need today? What is a priority for you? And it could be housing. It could be just needing a safe place. It could be, particular skills to employment. It could be family reunification. It could be getting mental health needs taken care of.
By and large, they know what they need help with. And sometimes it requires all of us to just listen.
And that's what we need to do.
Ian Galloway, Senior Research Associate at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Thank you for being with us. And let's listen to this email question from Bob Schlanger, who writes that the city always seems to be focused on economic development, which he writes has never generated that tide which is supposed to lift all boats. Are there cities that have successfully eliminated poverty, he asks, and if so, how did they do it?
Thanks for that question, Neal. The quick answer is no. It's very rare to see this happening at a city level. It's the rare instances where I think we've actually solved this problem have occurred on a neighborhood level, but they're few and far between. And one of the things, sort of keying off your the setup here for this third portion of the discussion, One of the impediments to rolling this out everywhere, and this goes back to the scale conversation, and this is, I'm going to borrow a comment that my mentor at the Federal Reserve, David Erickson, likes to make, and he says in these rare circumstances where you see comprehensive, holistic, coordinated, place-based community development work in the mold of the Harlem Children's Zone, for example, in New York City. Those rare instances where we have actually really moved the dial on poverty have two common elements. One is that they're run by a super genius, and the second is that super genius is friends with a billionaire.
That's great.
And this is the major impediment to doing this in all of the neighborhoods of concentrated poverty in the United States, is that that's not scalable. And we need to reform the systems that enable local leaders to accomplish change at that scale and empower them with sufficient resources to be successful.
That said, are there places that do this better than others?
Yeah, I would again, I mentioned Harlem Children's Zone. That's a well-known example in Harlem. It's a cradle-to-college program that actually begins in utero. They have a baby college where mothers-to-be and fathers-to-be come in and learn how to be effective parents. And then that child, upon being born, is placed into a very controlled pipeline of support services until they go to college. That has shown to be very successful in at least addressing the multi-generational component to poverty. The other example I would use is the Eastlake neighborhood just outside of Atlanta. Some of you may be familiar with this program. It's the Purpose-Built Communities program. And this was a neighborhood that was really suffering, had a 13%, going back to economic development, had a 13% employment rate in the neighborhood, not unemployment. Only 5% of students that lived in the neighborhood were testing at grade level in math, and only about a third of the kids in the neighborhood were graduating from high school. Fast forward 20 years, 97% of kids living in the neighborhood are testing at grade level in math, reading, and language arts. The crime rate has been reduced by 95%. And 100% of the community residents are employed or in a job training program. So that's an example of success.
Let me bring in John Petticone, the former superintendent of the Tucson Unified School District, now an educational consultant. And as you listen to that, with your experience, where do we start?
Well, you know, it's interesting to listen to, when people talk about Tucson as a generous community, it's really true. I mean, people here respond when there's any kind of a crisis and you see it being played out. There are organizations that have wonderful programs that get together to do some really remarkable things. But I think the key is in what you alluded to, and I think what you hear being said, is that in order for there to be sustainable change, there's got to be a system. And the system has to provide for how the parts fit together to move towards some kind of ultimate outcome. And the difficulty with this topic, for me anyway, having worked in 2 districts where the predominant population were low income, identified as in poverty by federal statistics, is that there has to be something that provides dignity and sustainability for the community. You have lots of different reasons why people are in poverty. You heard one person on a video talk about how he needed some help to get past the bump to be able to get on his feet. Well, there are individuals in the communities that we serve that are in sustainable poverty, that simply see no way to get out of that. So there has to be a way for us to be able to look at what's the vision to be able to move poverty as a secondary and move people into what we all believed we should have when we were growing up, and that's an opportunity to do something better and to be able to access that dream. It was interesting to hear Margaret talk about how she grew up on the south side of Chicago. I grew up on the west side of Chicago, a difficult neighborhood. We were poor, and yet I never didn't think that there was going to be an opportunity for me to be able to get past that. We made do, and we had a less complex environment to get into, a much simpler way of life. Today, kids are coming to school in a complex environment. Parents are finding it very, very difficult just to make ends meet, and that's different than the way it was when many of us grew up.
Yet, you say that, and it's a description of the problem. It's not a way forward.
Yeah, the way forward is what we're trying to do, I think, and schools become the center of that, where they become the center for community engagement to be able to, number one, certainly prepare students to be able to get access, higher levels of employment, but also to be able to do things with parents and community members to get together to be able to solve this problem systemically and through engagement. That, I think, schools have traditionally done, and our understanding must be our mission. It's no longer enough for a school to simply be an individual organization. It must be a community organization that brings people together.
Margaret Cheney, you've been involved in the system long enough to see one generation leading on to another generation and maybe a third. Where do we stop the cycle?
I think now we need to start empowering those families. That is to say, to include them in the conversations, to ask them directly, what is it that you need? How can we help you? And that would provide them with dignity as well as a feeling of empowerment. And I think that that's truly key.
How do you do that in a structural way? How do you do that in a structural way?
Well, I mean, the school, everyone knows where their schools are in their neighborhoods. And there was a time, back when John and I were kids, when that was the hub of the community. Everyone went there. Nowadays, I think that we're hubs of information, and we could utilize that center, our schools, to get that information out.
You know better than I do. Parents don't come to the school because they're too tired from working 2 jobs, from taking the bus across town to get to the job that doesn't pay them enough to take. Who asks the question, and when they answer, who listens?
I think that the working poor have to ask the question. Where do I go? That's where we come in to teach our students how to advocate for themselves. Because I've found as a teacher, if I pry too deeply, they shut down. And so I wait, I kind of feel around and okay, I wait, and then they will eventually tell me, but oftentimes they have to have the tools to understand how to advocate for themselves, to ask the right questions to the right people at the right time. And I think Tucson does have a lot of services and a lot of very caring people, which is one of the reasons I'm still here. But like it was said earlier, we have to get everyone working and collaborating together so that it can be more streamlined and it won't be as frustrating a process as it has been.
Go ahead, John.
I think schools need to be, as Margaret suggests, and we're trying to get at, the center for a lot of this synergy to take place. But schools have always been reactive institutions. Schools were established, public schools, to be able to meet a social issue, meet a social need. When the community expects schools to solve the problem, that is a community problem, we miss the mark. Again, I'll go back to everybody has a responsibility to work with solving this issue. Everyone has a responsibility to do what it takes to be able to move this agenda forward. And it's not enough to say it's somebody else's problem. So schools can do their part. But again, programs to help people stay afloat don't necessarily bring them to the next level of being able to engage in the work that takes place to lift them out of the situation they're in. And that's a community responsibility that schools can help with, but it can't be the school's individual responsibility alone.
Patty Caldwell, that was exactly what you were talking about.
Yeah, so I really think the kind of building on both what was just said about schools, schools can't be the solution, but I think what they can do is they can move forward in being a hub of activity, which I think is what allows and actually encourages and brings parents into the schools, not because they're going there for a teacher-parent conference, but because they're going there for services that they need. And those schools are open in the evenings, they're open on weekends. There's some of that conversation going on in Tucson now about how to better use the schools. I know we had a very interesting poverty simulation here last October, and one of the things that was, I think, very eye-opening for a lot of people was how much time it took for people who were already stressed with lots of things to do and serious transportation issues to actually get to all the places they needed to go to for all the things they needed to keep themselves afloat. And that's one of the things we can think about is how we create those hubs, and schools could be part of that part of that solution.
Ian Galloway, are schools those kinds of hubs in successful areas?
Yeah, I think schools play a really important role in any kind of community transformation, but point absolutely taken, these are very complex issues, and we can't put schools in a position to be responsible for fixing problems that are manifesting in communities well before they even come in contact with the kids that they're working with. So it's going to take a multifaceted, coordinated approach. And we've talked a little bit about coordination, but I have to say that this is one of, I think, the big challenges that the community development field faces, which is the field that I work in. To some extent, we get what we pay for. We don't pay for coordination. We talk about coordination, and we talk about how important it is and about how complex these problems are, but we don't pay for coordination. And to me, that's like building a house without a general contractor. It wouldn't make any sense. Why would we try to transform a complicated neighborhood without somebody or some organization taking a lead role coordinating the parties involved? But we don't have resources for that, and we don't value that, unfortunately.
Lane Kenworthy, let me turn to you. In the examples that you've looked at, there are some places that do have coordination, and that it's not a collaboration, it's a coordination. There's some people held responsible, some people held accountable.
Yeah, that's right. So we've begun to look at some cities, some big ones, some very small ones. So New York City, to take a great example, but also
Savannah. They had the billionaire and arguably the genius. You know.
That's right. So they certainly have the resources and they certainly have the impetus, but it's nonetheless useful to look at what they've done. But other cities as small as Savannah, Georgia, and what they have in common, at least what we've been able to figure out, is that there is an explicit coordinated effort to try to do this, not just through small-scale, one-off, episodic or occasional collaborations, all of which is fine. That's certainly a good thing to do. But an effort for everyone to come together, at least as many who are able and willing, to come together, often in a formally organized group, and to try to explicitly coordinate efforts. And this looks to be an effective route. And this seems to be part of what's happening now in Tucson.
Does that mean somebody is in charge?
It can be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
Does that government that takes that role?
Again, it can be, but so for example, in New York City, because the government was run by a billionaire who also had a lot of billionaire friends that he could rely on, there it made perfect sense for the government to sort of take charge and set up agencies that spearheaded many of the efforts. In other circumstances, that's not going to be the case. So there are lots of different ways to do this.
Would the billionaires in the audience like to step? Armenia.
Ian talked about community development, and I believe that there are other segments of our community that we haven't talked about, and that's the faith-based institutions, the churches that a lot of our parents go to, and probably have more faith in them, I mean, speaking, than maybe the schools or some of the other institutions. They are also hubs of those neighborhoods, and sometimes they are engaged, and other times they're not. I know one of the reasons why we have KidCo, one of the reasons why we have more adult education centers, why JobPath was created, was because of the organization of churches through this group called Pima County Interfaith Council, which is under the Industrial Areas Foundation. They have helped create at least resources for the total family. Now, a lot of it is due to funding, unfortunately, and sustainable. But I think that part of that community development is part of that constant involvement of those institutions where the community people have trust in, have faith in. So they should have been in these panels, but...
I'll get to you, Michael, in just a minute, but I wanted to ask Patty Caldwell, if we're talking about, rather than collaboration, we're talking about coordination. Somebody's going to tell you what to do. Somebody's going to tell you, no, that program, according to our metrics, isn't working. You should stop doing that. We're going to send that over to the United Way.
Well, so this may sound like I'm just being such a nice person, but the reality is, if I could take the same resources and do something better, and I knew that whatever somebody was saying I shouldn't keep doing because somebody else could do it better, and I could leverage what I do really well and scale it up even further, I would be excited to be part of that kind of coordination.
We'll go down to you, Peggy, in just a minute, but I did want to get to Michael.
You know, I just was struck, when you asked earlier, does that mean someone's in charge of the collaboration? I think that may be one of the deficiencies in our human service work is we don't have a sense of ownership. Who owns the public square? Who owns the common good? And that may be all of us, but we need social impact entrepreneurialism. We need that business mindset to draw capital, the private sector, to invest in human service outcomes, and maybe they make a small financial return for that risk, but we've got to look at innovative financing.
There's also the question of accountability. Now, the educators on this panel are all too familiar with accountability, and you're held to very strict standards. Whether they are appropriate or not is another issue, and maybe an issue for another panel. But the fact of the matter is, who holds the nonprofit groups accountable? Who says whether the money is being well used or not? Peggy?
Well, that's what I was going to say. So we've talked about comprehensive multi-sector community development. We've talked about that. We've talked about it's got to be business, it's got to be public, it's got to be not-for-profit entrepreneurs, both on the for and the nonprofit side. But we also need to have data and agree on an outcome. And if the data is saying, you know what, this feels really good, but it's not really working, we have to be willing to say, as Patty was saying, let it go. Let it go, because it may feel good, but it's not really making a difference. And if we are committed to that outcome, and we all can agree on that outcome, and we agree on the data sets, and we pay money, that's going to cost some money, right, to get real good data, then we have to also be willing, if we're really committed to our community, as Michael was talking about, and that value, we have to be willing to say, yeah, I'm not going to do that anymore. We're not going to do that anymore because it's not really making a difference. Feels great, but not making a difference.
Molly Castellato?
I think, to take off of a couple of points, positioning, understanding the data, and also positioning the programs that they're not just to help because we're nice people, but this is an economic development issue. And for example, targeted early childhood education programs, high quality early education programs, have an ROI of $11.40 for every $1 spent. And that extends across the community in higher wages and thus taxes paid, and money expended in cost avoidance in terms of crime reduction. So
But
we
given
do
those
know
kind
what
of
works.
statistics, money for those programs should be no problem then.
And so in the state of Arizona, and there are lots of examples like that where we do have the statistics that show the benefits of these programs. And in the state of Arizona, we're going in the opposite direction. We're defunding publicly funded kindergarten, for example.
And again, I'm not arguing with you a bit, but again, we're talking about them in Phoenix and what they should do, which, forgive me, they're not likely to do tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. So what are we going to do here with what we've got so that we can make a start to change this, and we can get going and make an even better argument to the relevant committees in Phoenix to say, this is why you need to provide this funding. Armenia.
Well, I think both Patty and Peggy have talked about how looking at within and saying who does what, and then giving that away and then focusing on what you do well. We are right now in discussion with two other groups that also believe in helping what we call the first generation student and trying to make sure that they're successful at Pima College, the U of A, or wherever they're at. And so that instead of this thing of scale, I want more money because I could do this better, pooling our resources and saying, okay, what can we do as a group? And what happens to funding is that we triple our funding for this particular population. So those, I think, are some of the innovations and some of the thinking that we have to start doing. I think somebody passed along an article that was put out by, what's it called, Stanford somewhere, but that talks about the nonprofits need to start thinking differently about how to make the impact. And we're looking at that, and more of that kind of collaboration needs to be done.
Let me go to another email question. This is from Barbara in Tucson. At both my work, a medical setting, and at my supermarket, there are many employees who utilize public transportation. These employees are greatly impacted by increases in bus fares and reductions in service. Is there any research about cities that provide free public transportation as an element of economic development? In Galloway, can you help us out there?
So that's not an area of particular expertise for me, so I can't speak as intelligently on that subject as probably other people on the panel. But I will say that when we think about the working poor, it's important not to just think about housing affordability. That's sort of our go-to sort of metric for can you afford to live in the place that you work. It's important that you consider the other costs associated with where you choose to live that factor into your daily budget. And by that I mean transportation costs and energy costs. And if you add up those three costs, you'll realize that for a lot of people, particularly the working poor, it gobbles up an enormous amount of their discretionary income. So it's a big factor, and cities and municipalities that can support the working poor and others with transportation options. Most cities do subsidize public transportation. I don't know of any, perhaps the subway system in New York City being the lone exception. I don't know of any public transportation systems that are self-sufficient without some public subsidy. Obviously, more could be done on that front, but I defer to the folks on the panel.
Let me ask you, Michael McDonald, does anybody come to the food bank by bus?
All the time. Yeah, transportation is a big issue. Access to food and food equity is a huge issue. We're serving 23,000 square miles. We just can't get everywhere unless Amazon does develop those little drones. Right?
Those drones, yeah.
Yeah. You know, I want to say, even though I've said that we need social impact entrepreneurialism, we need private sector investment, I'm thinking of my friend Peg Harmon out here with Catholic Community Services. Sometimes our safety net services are just basic human rights. People deserve access to basic human rights. And so I don't think that business is going to solve everything, but we certainly need as much business investment as possible. We have a very charitable business community, but I'm talking about investment and making both a social return and a financial return on that.
John Petticone.
And interesting, the bishop convened a group of people to look at our refugee population some time ago. And the issue that came up that was the number one impediment was transportation, exactly what we're talking about. So there were a couple of local business leaders, Jim Click was one of them, got together with the bishop, and they created a fund to be able to provide, and Suntran, by the way, the city cooperated with that, to provide transportation so that refugees could get from where they are to where they could work. They could get to churches, because churches were a huge partner in all of this. So the things that people are talking about are actually taking place. But again, the key is, and I'll go back to my feeling about any kind of whether it be social change or any kind of serious change, in order for it to be sustainable, it's got to be systemic. And there has to be, as you're suggesting, some leadership that brings, not only it brings it together, but in the end, makes some decisions about where the priorities are going to be, together with the people that are there. That's what appears to be missing, not just in Tucson, but across the state.
And it's not political will, it's political leadership?
I think a great deal of it is both, but certainly it's, tell me, Gates came to this, to our state, and they were going to try to do some work, okay, in Arizona. And they called a couple of people together, I was one of them, and they asked this question: is there, number one, the will in the state to get this to happen? And secondly, who would lead it? Who would lead it? And you step back and you think about who in the state of Arizona could you depend upon that people would trust, doesn't have another agenda going on, that would have the credibility and the strength to be able to make that happen. And I'm sorry, that there's an absence of the individuals, if you want to think about it. And that's unfortunate.
So Patty Caldwell, who's going to call that meeting where you're going to go and talk about what you're not going to do and what you might do better?
Maybe there's somebody in the audience who's actually planning to step forward to do that.
Next to the billionaire.
Yeah, the super genius billionaire out there. So there are some nonprofits who are taking it upon themselves to do that, who are calling themselves together and are trying to look around and see who else is interested, is willing to kind of put their territorialism to one side and really think long and hard about the community we live in, because we love this place and we are compassionate for our friends, our neighbors, and colleagues, and many of us at one point in our lives have been that one pink slip, one paycheck away from having to use the services that we offer. You know, the mayor did form a commission on poverty, and we're having those conversations, and I think that's one useful place. It's not enough yet. It's not enough.
Let me bring in Lola Rainey, who works with a group called Kids Kitchen Alaska, which is set to expand its program to Tucson this year. She sent this email. In 2011, Arizona ranked 5th in the nation for the number of food-insecure children. While much of the public attention is focused on meeting the needs of hungry families, should we not develop a separate strategy for tackling insecurity for hungry children? And Margaret Cheney, this is something that you talked about that affects your classroom every day.
You know, when I was growing up, the Black Panthers formed a organization down the street from us and fed us every morning.
School breakfast, yeah.
School breakfast program, and it was amazing. And we found at our school that the day of the Ames test, if we feed those children whatever we can find, not donuts, but something nutritional that we can find, that they do better. Their scores are improved. And it's very encouraging. And I try to teach my students, you know, watch what you eat, watch how much you eat, watch when you eat. It all makes a difference. But that's difficult for them when they say, well, Miss, I've decided I'm going to become a vegetarian, but I can't afford the produce. You know, it's really heartbreaking sometimes when they want to make that change and they can't. So,
John Petticone, those kids are blessed to live in an area where it is relatively easy to grow your food. Is it the school's job to teach kids and their parents to grow their own food, to be more sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see in schools across Tucson Unified and districts around the city exactly that taking place. And so the answer should be yes. It should be the school's responsibility to not only provide an opportunity for where produce can be grown, but also to provide the education to students and also parents. You know, there are a number of schools in Tucson Unified where they actually invite parents in to share a plot within a community garden on the school campuses, and it works very, very well. And the idea of, I forget where this took place, but there's a city somewhere where one of the local philanthropists created a mechanism for delivering fresh produce to inner cities. And what he found was exactly what we're talking about, that kids did better in school. It was something that was tangible, that you could actually see results from, that business seeks, by the way. That's one of the questions that business leaders ask. What can we do? And that was an answer to that. So I think, yes, the answer is we should share that responsibility.
So let's envision ourselves as one of those people who got that pink slip or got that diagnosis or fell off the edge. We may have heard of Habitat for Humanity. We may have heard of some of the programs that are on this panel. We may be aware that the city or the state or the federal government can help us out. Michael McDonald, where would you start? Where would you go? Is there a clearinghouse? Is there one place that can say, well, you might go here for some help with food to the food bank, or you might go here with some help with housing, talk to Patty Caldwell.
Right. You know, unfortunately, there's not one clearinghouse. And so that's how we collaborate a lot, is we are working with the same folks. And so we cross-refer our clients all the time to services, connect them. I really wanted to, you know, the whole school garden thing is so important because, you know, the Community Food Bank has we have partnerships with TUSD, 20 school gardens. Now, that's just a small number of the schools that are possible. But what's great about that is we've got intellectual capital that we're sharing. You have a physical asset that you're sharing called your school, the hub, where we layer these services. We can produce our own food. We had to get the Pima County health director, who was wonderful, to get through the policy and regulatory barriers to allow food that is grown at school to be served in the school cafeteria.
That's right. That's right.
So we've got a number of barriers out there that are regulatory that we can have the will to do, and the political leadership to do it, and then we could probably save the school some money by you guys not having to buy so much produce and ship it in to Tucson and grow it locally. So I think unfortunately, we don't have one place that's the go-to place for all these innovative ideas and services, and that's why we need to refer to each other. We've had a number of attempts at that, but they come and go, and it is about the willingness to pay for that kind of central clearinghouse, and I don't think we've quite got that, but Patty's been working on some things.
Well, I mean, I would just say, I don't want to discount the incredible service that 211 provides.
Right.
The reality is it's a comprehensive database from across the state that's accessible either online or by phone. And frankly, they get thousands and thousands and thousands of visits to the website and calls all the time. And their top 5 or 6 needs that people are calling for is about emergency assistance of one kind or another, whether it's food, whether it's rent assistance. That's what people are calling for all the time to that number. And I guess the other piece I would go back to, I'm really thinking about this, who convenes? And it's really nice that the Community Foundation of Southern Arizona is one of the co-sponsors. The reality is, if I'm a funder, I would want to know how my investment's being used and whether I'm getting the most bang for my buck. And I think it would be wise if the primary investors in our community that are funding many of us, whether we're talking about the city, the county, the community foundations, some very large private foundations in town, would actually help bring us together to have those conversations, not in a threatening way, but in a really supportive, we want to do this together, and we want to partner with you to figure out how to do it better.
Lane Kenworthy, that one-stop shopping, is that a feature in some of the cities that you've looked at where it works, or it works better?
Yeah, I think so. We don't know yet whether that's absolutely critical, but it certainly is something that a number of cities, and this is actually true not just in the United States, but in some other countries too, that they've been moving toward because it makes all the sense in the world. There are one of the really interesting, fascinating developments in the academic study of poverty in recent years is a better understanding of cognitive overload. So people who are in stressful situations, largely because of finances or particular needs that they have, and they don't know exactly where to go, they have trouble making, or can have trouble making decisions about how to find resources and access to them. So the easier we can make this, in all likelihood, the more helpful it is to people.
Ian Galloway, I know you don't speak for the entire Federal Reserve nor the Federal Reserve of San Francisco, but if you were elected king of Tucson tomorrow, where would you start?
Wow, thank you for that question. I'd actually like to go back to something that Michael has teed up very well thus far, this idea behind investable opportunities in human capital. And I mean that quite literally. We don't have any investable opportunities in human capital. We talk about investing in early childhood education and other services that we know in the long run will produce savings and accrue benefit to the individuals who participate in the programs. But why can't I invest in Patty, and Patty can then sell some improved social outcome to Pima County, and then Patty can use the proceeds of that sale to pay me back as an investor plus interest? Why doesn't that mechanism exist? And what we're seeing is that increasingly these are the types of conversations that people are having. And some of you may be familiar with the social impact bond. This is that type of approach. And I think that if I was king of Pima County, I would fast track approval of a pretty radical change in the way that I procure social outcomes. Instead of investing in programs that have a history of success, but ultimately you're investing in a promise, I would instead commit to paying for only success. So if you reduce the number of kids with type 2 diabetes in a given neighborhood, or childhood obesity, or whatever social outcome you care about in this particular community, if you accomplish that, I commit to paying you for delivering that outcome. That opens up all sorts of investable opportunities, quite literally, that private investors in the private sector can participate directly in.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
Herminia Cubillos, is this an approach that you think would work in your program?
I was talking to Ian that I read about that social impact bond 2 years ago in The Economist and how they were doing it in Great Britain for the homeless. I was fascinated by that. I think that that's something that could work, that would work well. I'm very pleased about our data because we know what we're doing in terms of the impact we're making, at least in this cohort of people. Like to do it with a lot more people, but anyway, I think it would work, and it would be innovative. It would probably stir a lot of other ideas that we hadn't even thought about.
Patty Caldwell, I understand Pima County is talking about social capital investment.
Yeah, and I wanted to take Ian up on if he'd like to invest in our family services. I'll be happy to sell a social outcome.
That's King Ian to you.
King Ian.
But does he have $1 billion? That's what I want to know.
I think the royal coffers may be a little thin. But as we move ahead, what thing, Lane Kenworthy, would you recommend that would come out of this conversation? And this is a conversation obviously didn't begin tonight. It's not going to end tonight. But as this conversation continues, where do we go next? What's the next logical step?
Yeah, so I think the immediate thing is better coordination and information sharing of services. Setting aside the possibility of injecting a lot more money, which would be great. And just as an aside, or maybe not as an aside, if there were a lot more money, the first and foremost thing I would do is early education. But setting that aside, I think this better coordination and information sharing of services, maybe an increased use of one-stop shop types of things, is something that's very practicable, could be done. And also, I think holds out the possibility of not just kind of pooling efforts, but doing things better through information sharing and better communication.
Molly Castellazzo, as you've been listening to this conversation, I wonder, how much does accountability play into this? Who's responsible? To whom are they accountable? How do they measure whether something is succeeding or not? I mean, whether it's social investment or whether it's the kind of programs that we have now.
I mean, I think, going back to this notion of looking at programs not only as opportunities to help individuals, but to improve the economy as well, we have to measure both the social and the economic outcomes. And I think both, the funders as well as the people who are implementing the program, spending the money, should absolutely be held accountable, and we should have very clear publicly available metrics.
And what kind of metrics? Who gets to decide?
I mean, I think that and it's a broad metric, but basically it's return on investment. So I spend $1 on early childhood education, or I spend $1 on community college education, and what do I get back? Do I get back $12 or do I get back $16?
Yeah, but sometimes you don't know for 20 years.
Yeah, fortunately, with a lot of these programs, there have been some excellent longitudinal studies done that show us, and in a lot of these cases, we do have the data based on the 20, 30-year longitudinal studies that show the results. And I wanted to mention too, Neal, that I think, thinking about innovative ways that we can tackle the issue of poverty, of course, is important, and boots on the ground, and what can we do today? But when we talk about the people in Phoenix, those people down in Phoenix or those people over in DC, we elect them. And so what can we do today, all of us? Well, we can go talk to our policymakers, and if we don't like the policies that they're passing, then we elect someone new. And I think that that's important to remember, that we do have that power.
Interesting. Elect someone new. Lane Kenworthy, in the structures that have worked, someone has been held accountable, and that is generally an elected official, correct?
It depends. people care about an awful lot of stuff, and so how their elected officials are doing by way of the poor in the community is only one consideration. There's no guarantee that they're going to respond first and foremost to that. When I say they, I mean voters, so it's hard to say.
I want to get a commitment from each of you. Where are we meeting tomorrow? And what we're going to do tomorrow. What are we going to do to help you to make this begin to work a little bit better? But I wanted to get back to the problem, and I wanted to bring Peggy Hutchison back in. This is an email from a blogger, Carolyn Klassen in Tucson. Wages, she writes, are so low in Tucson. How can working families ever make ends meet? I don't see how they can ever get out of poverty, especially if they have several children, because we're talking about innovations, all of which is great. These are people with specific problems.
Yes, absolutely. So when we talk about whose responsibility it is, we also have to look at our own shops, our own businesses, our own places of work. Do the folks that we hire make a living wage? What do we need to do about our own shops, our own places to make a difference? Because that's also an investment. So are the folks that work with us, for us, making a living wage? And let's talk about transportation, since I have the microphone. We are one of very few cities in this nation that go beyond the federal mandate of an economy fare for public transportation. Economy fare is mandated by the federal government for senior citizens and people with physical disabilities. Tucson has taken a place ahead of many other cities to say we also understand that the economy fare for public transportation is an economic development strategy for our city, because so many people are not making a living wage. And for them to be able to go back and forth to work, we want to make sure that if they're really working poor, they can also use the economy fare. And that's an investment in our people. That's an investment in community economic development, whether we understand it or not. But we can each do something about looking at our own businesses and shops and say, are we paying a living wage for the people that are doing the work in our businesses?
It's also worth looking at some of the list of the major employers in Tucson. People like Raytheon or the University of Arizona. Somebody's not paying a living wage, if you look at the statistics. Let me ask you that question about the commitment. What are we going to do tomorrow? Michael McDonald, what are you going to do tomorrow?
Well, I think it's for all of us. I'm struck by this investment in human capital, and Peggy's challenging us in our own shops, even nonprofit shops, investing in our own human capital. And an investment is you're taking a short-term sacrifice for a longer-term benefit. You're going to withhold getting that benefit today. And we need to do that financially. But as Lane said, what if there's no big capital showing up tomorrow? What can we do? When we show up in these rooms like this, it's the same 300 people, right? And we have a great tradition in our shadow side of our culture here in Tucson of sitting on the sidelines and taking pot shots and criticizing. And what I would say is what we need to do tomorrow is dive in, all in investment of my time and talent, my human capital, in a cause that matters, that is going to invest in our human capital. Even if I don't have the money tomorrow, I can show up at my school and volunteer. I can show up and help with Job Path. I can show up and invest something of my intellectual capital to invest in someone else's intellectual capital. So that's what we're going to do tomorrow.
Herminia Cubillos, you're going to go back to work tomorrow.
I go back to work tomorrow. I want to thank you for moderating this. It just energizes what I am doing with these other organizations, and see if we can create a collaboration, one of many, but knowing that this is the common goal we have that we can work at. We're also involving Pima Community College, and as then we begin to share that information, because we do that best, and then begin to share that information with others so that we're feeding each other and feeding, in other words, feeding there are people that Patty might have or Peggy might have that are ready to jump into job path, and that we know that, and we know where they're coming from, so that we're constantly doing those things, so that there's a pathway, there's something that moves on. So it's got to be organic, it's got to be a pathway, and we're not, the big dollars aren't there anymore. So let's do what we do best.
John Petticone, let me ask you, as you look toward a next step, what should it be?
Well, and I'm going to go back again and suggest that people keep thinking about systems, because that's what we're talking about. Think systems, and then we have a chance to see how the parts can fit together with an objective in mind. But we didn't talk a lot about the heroes that work in classrooms on a daily basis that make the difference in the futures of our students. This conversation got somewhat dispersed in a way because we talk about a very complex problem. What do we do to try to address the needs of people that are experiencing poverty at this point? How do we lift and keep families afloat so that they can continue to work toward getting something better? But the other aspect of that, one of the many aspects, is what do we do to make sure that our children don't have to incur the same situation? That's what we have in our society, certainly in our nation, but in this community with teachers. We do such a terrible job honoring teachers. We give lip service like we do to so many other things. Everybody says how much they appreciate teachers, and yet when it comes to ponying up and paying for teachers, it's really a terrible embarrassment. I'll give you one quick example, and then I'll let you know what we're doing about it, okay? One quick example is that I left a district in 2004 that I was in for 22 years. When I left there, the starting salary for teachers, this is a beginning teacher coming out of the university, was a little over $31,000, and that was with career ladder and some things we could cobble together. That same teacher today, coming into that same district, makes $29,000 a year. Okay? So it's not fiction, it's the truth. And if you look at salaries across the region, it's not much different. So there's an effort in this community, I think it's been a bold effort that has hit a bunch of barriers because of the economy, called Tucson Values Teachers. And we're working with that group now to try to take it to the next level, take it to scale, where we can demonstrate not just through a supply drive or through some things that really benefit teachers that we really respect and care about them, but how do we lift them to where we provide increased degrees, where we look at helping elementary teachers get trained in science and math, which is the thing that keeps a teacher in an organization. In addition to pay, it's the respect they feel from the organization. And those are the things we should be doing as well.
And I know, Ian Galloway, that you think what we are experiencing now is the lack of investment 20 and 30 years ago in exactly what John Petticone is talking about. So should we be focusing on investment in our kids and our schools and our teachers so that we're not having the same conversation 20 years from now?
Absolutely.
Well, of course, we should be doing both, which is hard because we live in a world of finite resources. But I would point out, I would sort of emphasize this point. There are about 20.4 million Americans living in deep poverty today. And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, those are folks that live under 50% of the poverty line. So if the poverty rate line is about $15,000 for a household of four, that's $7,500 a year for 20.4 million Americans. And we have to think about the corrosive effects that has on the kids growing up in those households. Poverty, the latest research suggests poverty actually imprints on your health, and it imprints on your ability to hold down a job, and it imprints on your ability to be self-sustaining and economically viable when you do launch into your career. So yes, I think that if we can focus on both problems, we will save ourselves a lot of challenges 20 years from now, with the caveat being that we do live in a world of finite resources.
And I think we're beginning to understand why we hope to have our next event like this on education. But before we leave this panel, Margaret Cheney, what are you going to be doing tomorrow when you open that textbook?
I was afraid you would ask me that question. Tomorrow, after I have taught my classes, planned my lessons, graded my papers, and worked on my IEPs, I am planning to write to my board members and to my principal and ask more about the school being a hub and following through with that farming idea. That is to say, we have these wonderful gardens on some of our schools, but we have some empty schools now. We've had to close some down. I don't know that they're all sold. I don't know what their progress is, but if they're going to have all this land around those buildings, why not use some of that land to build bigger gardens so we can feed more of our kids, so that we can send it to our cafeterias and we can truly be sustainable or self-sustaining. That's what I'm planning on doing.
Molly Castellato, what are you doing tomorrow?
What am I doing tomorrow? I am going to take, this is actually just a very short summary of the report that will be released soon, but I really, where I can add value to the conversation, the ongoing conversation, is by bringing the data and saying, here's what we know about what works, what doesn't work, and how these programs have been funded. And bring that to the conversation so that we can have a conversation not just about what we know, but about what's out there as well.
So King Ian can get his consigliere, Molly. Peggy Hutchison, what are you doing tomorrow?
Well, I am having breakfast with a representative of a financial institution in the morning, and I'm going to ask that person if they're willing to put at least $50,000 to step up to a pay-for-success model for Pima County, and then wait and listen.
For the pin to drop.
Yeah. I think it's also about asking. Are we willing to think big? Because that's what we need. And ask, and challenge, and listen.
Michael McDonald, you going to do something different tomorrow?
Well, I want to work with Margaret on those gardens, that's for sure. I do think, I think focusing on our most vulnerable population and that future that we've talked about, our children, that next generation, I think that I'm going to be working on that with our board, is how do we help that next generation so that they show up and they're not hungry and they're ready to learn and their intellectual capital grows. That's our economic development future, our children.
Patty Caldwell, let me turn to you.
Well, I'm going to practice what I preach and make sure that I continue to look at the services and programs that I offer at my own organization and make sure that I'm only doing what we can do best and making sure that those programs actually have the potential to be able to truly have solid social outcomes, not just outputs. And simultaneously, I'm very intrigued with what Ian's been talking about related to pay for success and social impact bond models. And so I'm going to continue to invest some of my time in talking with people in our community and building some momentum to make that happen as soon as Peggy gets that other $50,000.
And Lane Kenworthy, a year from now, if we're back here to check on what everybody's doing, what are you going to be looking at as success?
I'll have to think more about that. But let me, since I have the mic, let me mention that one of the things that I'll be doing, not tomorrow, but on Fridays, I have an undergraduate class this semester with about 40 students, some of whom are here, that's sponsored by the university in partnership with the Mayor's Commission on Poverty, some of the members of which are at the table here, that's going to be going out in the community and interviewing about 250 or so, mostly low-income Tucsonans, to try to get a better understanding than we already have about some of the struggles they face, what they know about what they do when they need help, and to get a better sense of what we could do better. So that's one of the ways that I and others at the university are trying to contribute to this conversation.
We also have a challenge for you. What are you going to be doing different tomorrow? We're going to ask you to think about it, and we're also going to ask you to answer a pop quiz, which you have found on the chairs when you walked in. It's a questionnaire that, if you'd be so kind to fill it out, we'd be most appreciative. There is also one more player on this stage that we need to address before we leave this evening. On behalf of Arizona Public Media, I can pledge that we will continue to report this story, that what we've learned tonight and earlier will inform our editorial choices, and that we will make sure the working poor remain visible so far as we're able to do that. And one more thing, we're going to report on how these groups and others follow through on what we've talked about tonight and whether it makes a difference. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.
Community Interactive, Poverty, the Working Poor, was made possible in part by support from the Arizona Daily Star, Cox Communications, and Nancy and Peter Davis.